Welcome to Unleashed, the podcast where we redefine leadership by focusing on what truly matters, the people driving change. Change leadership is about guiding people through transformation in a way that inspires them to embrace change because they believe in it. Whether you're a leader looking to foster a culture of growth or someone eager to break through barriers in life and business, this podcast is for you. Now our host, Wendi.
Welcome to the Unleashed podcast. I am Wendi Swanson, and I am your host. Today's guest is Peter Smith. He has been in the jewelry business for 4 decades. He is the former president of Hearts on Fire, Memoire, and Vibhor. He is the author of several well-known books on selling and hiring, including Hiring Squirrels, 12 Essential Questions to Uncover Great Retail Sales Talent, Sell Something, Principles and Perspectives for Engaged Retail Salespeople, and the Sales Minute, 101 Tips for Retail Salespeople. Peter is a columnist for National Jeweler and the Jewelry Book, where he writes about retail, branding, sales, and hiring. This is going to be a 2-part podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the psychology of sales. And then in the next episode, part 2, tune in to hear the 12 essential questions Peter asks in the interview process that helps to uncover great retail sales talent. Peter, welcome.
Thank you so much, Wendi, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation and obviously our follow-up where we'll get more into hiring salespeople.
I am looking forward to that as well. Peter, sales is an interesting profession. And, I think it's interesting because, most people when they're 13, 14, 15 years old, they don't, wake up in the morning and go, oh, mom, dad, I can't wait to be a salesperson. Often it's an industry that either you work in while you're headed somewhere else, or, if you're like me and maybe like you, I'm anxious to hear your story. I kind of fell into the career of sales. So tell our listeners a little bit about how you got started in sales and what has kept you there for over 4 decades.
So true. I mean, that you rarely ever meet anybody who says, "Hey, my path was sort of laid out for me, and I chose to be in sales." For me, I was born and raised in Ireland, in Dublin, and what I was supposed to do in my own head was to play professional football, or soccer as it's called over here, football in Ireland. And as a young kid, I left school very early and I just got a job. And that job I happened to get. And I did so by getting in line. There was about 50 people in line on the street, which reflects the time over there at that stage. What happened to be in a wholesale jewelry company, right? And so I fell into the jewelry business. And then when I moved to the US in the 80s, I went to work for retailers. So I worked for 100 chain retail operation for a period of time. I went to work for a little known company called Tiffany and Co., who at that point had about 8 stores, 7 or 8 stores at that stage. So, so you're right that I never aspired, as is the case, I think, in general, to be in sales. But having found myself in sales, I fairly quickly became very, very interested in sales, what drove salespeople and what made salespeople tick. And so a part of it, I suspect, was just this massive sort of need to, on a very practical level, make better hires and do a better job with the folks that we were working with. And then that just sort of gradually grew into a little bit of an obsession, probably 20 or 30 years ago, really kicked into overdrive. So, having hired salespeople and built teams over the years, it just fed on itself, quite frankly.
Yeah. So, can you think of the time, that was the tipping point that you just said, Peter, this is my passion and this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life? Or did it just kind of evolve?
It's a great question. And I think my motivation had always been to be better doing what I was doing. And it wasn't sort of, let's look 5 years down the road or let's look 10 years down the road. It was always more, how can you be more effective today what can I do today to make things a little bit better? Part of that was my own sort of selling process. And then ultimately it became, as you hired people and developed teams and whatnot, what makes them tick? What makes them better? What's interesting about this person that makes them very successful versus that person who seems to have all the trappings of a great salesperson, but just isn't. And I know that we'll get into some more of that stuff in part two of this as we sort of talk about salespeople. But I just think it was, I'd be lying if I said there was some master plan. There was certainly no master plan to get into it, no master plan to master it, but a consequence of sort of being in it for many decades and having this crazed hunger virtually daily to learn more about it. That's sort of what fueled my passion.
So good. I think that's a pretty common story, Peter. I
Yeah.
would say the same. I started at 15 years old at a specialty clothing store that was my favorite place to shop. And I started, wanting the discount. And I certainly didn't realize that I would find my passions of training and development and connecting with customers and people. So I love the stories.
Well, I
I guess
mean, sorry, I totally agree. The one thing I wanted to add to it is, as we both found, I suspect, is that sales, particularly retail sales, is often thought of as a catch-all, right? If you can't get a job anyplace else, go get a job in retail. But as you're in it, and as you begin to develop a career in retail, you understand the powerful nuances between those who really make a difference, those who really drive business. I'm not just talking about at a salesperson's level, but operators and owners and what have you, versus those who sort of they do okay. And
yeah.
so I think that when we talk about sales as a bit of a catch-all, in some respects, we do a terrible disservice to the really outstanding professionals who make their career in retail, because those are the people that excite me and those are the people I tend to be drawn to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And what we know to be true, being in this industry for so long, is sales is one of the highest paid careers. It's also one of the lowest paid careers. So, there's a big disparity between the great and the not so great. So, as we talk about that, Peter, I'm curious, you've been in it for a while, I've been in it for a while, and we have certainly seen an evolution in how the consumer responds to sales and to salespeople. And therefore, I think, this whole career of sales has evolved, whether it be in retail, whether it be in business to business. How has your approach to selling changed over the years, or has it?
Well, I think that you have both sort of your own experiences within it and what has been your evolution, and you also have then the sort of macro evolution in terms of the space that we do, our best work. Obviously, for me now, and really for the last 25, 30 years, it's been selling to retailers, right? But still having a tremendous, almost obsession with understanding that place. And I think there's two things that have happened. One is that retail has really evolved, right? And we've seen it evolve, over a 10-year period. And I think that the best comment I ever had, and it's a micro, the comment itself is sort of a micro expression on what has happened, came from Phil Waba, who's a senior writer at Fortune magazine. Phil Waba said, retail isn't dying, only shitty retail is.
Yeah,
And I think in some respects,
so true.
he captured the evolution, the lightning fast evolution of retail in that comment. And if you look at the numbers of what's going on in retail, you'll get the sort of naysayers tell you, do you know that 4,000 stores closed, physical stores closed last year? And what they fail to mention is the fact that 5,600 opened, right? And so you have this changing of the guard that's happening in retail, as we're seeing in some cases former online people, Warby Parker and folks like that come in and open physical retail. But in other cases, just a general evolution of retail and new retail. So I think that has changed very significantly. And I think to a large extent for the better. Like when you and I first started in this business, there were Montgomery Wards and there were Woolworths and there were Sears was a thing. Sears in the 70s was the biggest retailer on the planet. So if you look at them as a microcosm of what's happened, there is an awful lot to be excited about to me that's going on in retail. And part of that is that sort of physical evolution that's happening out there. The other thing is our understanding of what makes people successful selling has been driven largely by psychology and by not just psychology, period, but by an element of psychology that people talk about as behavioral economics. In other words, you take the psychology of what makes people tick, what makes them do what they do, what motivates them, what demotivates them, et cetera, et cetera. And then you bring that into the retail space because we know what people will respond to sitting in a restaurant or what they'll respond to sitting next to you on an airplane or what they respond in any gathering of other people doesn't switch off when they walk into retail stores, right? When they walk into a retail store, those same things are in place. And so understanding a little bit about what motivates human beings, and certainly, as I said, what demotivates them, becomes a hugely important thing. And I think if you look at the best execution of retail, they're bringing psychology into it, not just from the people standpoint, but from all of the physical space, the decisions they make around product, the decisions they make around architecture, all of that stuff is beginning to evolve. And I suppose if I could put one theme on it, if I was writing a book about the evolution of retail, it would have to have some version of, what is your business about? What is, because retailers, if consumers rather have to try very hard to figure out what you're about. And again, maybe that sort of speaks to the reason that Woolworths and Sears and some of these places are no longer around. They just move on, right? They just simply move on. They're not going to spend a lot of time figuring out what you're about. And so that would be to me one of the questions I would ask of any retailer is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And will that reflect when I walk into your place of business? So I think it's both what's happening in the retail space and the psychology of that, and then also what we're learning about the psychology of people, which really just started at pace in the 1990s, because that's really when we began to understand when, fMRI machines came in so we could start to understand better why people responded to this brand versus that brand, et cetera, et cetera. So there have been massive changes, I think, over the last 20, 25 years in retail, and even changes since COVID, right? Which we expected, well, is that the end? I mean, we were really talking about retail and saying, is this the end of retail? And after the first 3, 4, 5 months, and certainly in my industry, in the jewelry industry, it became historically fantastic results and stayed that way for a period of years. So consumers sort of said, hey, physical retail matters to us. Engaging with other human beings matters to us. And so they were driven into retail stores. Now, getting back to the point I made about the evolution of retail, they don't want to have to work really hard to figure out what you're about when they get in. They need to understand what you're about before they,
right.
come in.
Yeah.
Which, consistent digital presence and so on and so forth really helps. But I think that it is both a great time for retail and it is a challenging time for retail. The reality is, as Waba's comment said, if you haven't evolved as a retailer, if you're still doing what you were doing 10, 15, 20 years ago, the future probably isn't too bright. But if you're really engaged in experiential retail and retail, that with great people and a real point of view, I'm fiercely optimistic about that.
Yeah, I am too. And I think what we're going to see is we're going to see the rise of the best because there's not as many retailers that are doing it well. And, so I think those ones who are doing it well are certainly going to lead the way. And, you're exactly right, Peter. We have seen this evolution in retail that, I had a conversation with my son not too long ago. And I said, honey, you do know that I was alive before the internet, right? And he's like, oh, yeah, okay, mom, sure. Like, how did you email? I'm like, no, honey, like, really, we didn't have email. And all throughout the day, my son is thinking about, well, how did you do this? And how did you do that? And he finally asked me, how did you order airline tickets? And Peter, I had to think about it for a minute. I'm like, how did I buy my airline tickets? And, we had this big black book. It was a flight book. And I know I'm totally aging myself. Life has changed. And has that dramatically changed retail, just even the internet?
I'm laughing inside listening to you talk about that because I think first of all, we had things called travel agents, right? There were actual
Yes, we
human
did.
beings that we would call. I want to go here, and they would get back to you with information. As recently as, and this they talk about aging ourselves, as the '90s, I worked for a jewelry company in Rhode Island called Calibri. And we did a huge amount of our product development in overseas, so China, Korea, etc. And on a daily basis, Wendy, if you saw the reams, the absolute reams of faxes, right? Because that's how we communicated every day. And you literally had people employed to go through the faxes and to apportion, oh, you're the product development manager for this. Here's your multiple faxes. It was unbelievable how we communicated then, long before. So I totally relate to that. And uh,
We have
we're
certainly
a lot
seen
better.
changes, with
Gotten
the
a lot better.
internet. Now a tag word in retail is certainly the omni-channel word. And,
Yeah.
whether it's, ordering online and then coming to pick it up, here's what we know to be true in the evolution of retail that's going to lead us right to where we're going today, which is the psychology of sales. And that is, you look at all of these changes that have happened over the years. And when we look at the psychology of sales, just define for us first of all what the psychology of sales means. What is that? And then I really want to get into some specific things that in sales you believe the best of the best do as takeaways for our listeners. So
Right.
tell us what this means, psychology of sales.
In some respects, it's a little bit like saying, describe for me what rock music is, right? Because people will go everything from this end of the continuum all the way to the other end of the continuum. But I think basically a description for for psychology is a scientific study of mind and behavior. That's the way we can think about it. It's a scientific study of mind and behavior, and it gets into how emotions are created, what motivates people, what demotivates people, and to a large extent, those the findings, the learnings come from studies. Through academic studies, they come from the fMRI testing, they come from observations, etc. So what psychology is a burgeoning awareness of what motivates human beings. And so when you get into psychology of sales specifically, it is just simply taking those learnings and taking that into a retail space. Again, because as I mentioned earlier on, humans don't become a subset of themselves when they walk into a retail store. The things that excite them, the things that sort of, move them, that's the same when they get into a retail store as when they're outside a retail store. So the more we understand that, the more we understand how we can maximize our engagement with other human beings, the better we're going to be for it. In our world, of course, that means more sales, better sales, but it could be in any element of business. That understanding psychology, the more we understand psychology, the more we understand how to engage appropriately and efficiently for both parties in a sales environment.
Well, and I'm going to go back, Peter, to something you said a little bit earlier that was actually surprising to me because I really hadn't thought about it this way. When you refer to the psychology of sales, you're not just talking the salesperson, you're also talking about the environment, the lighting, the fragrance, the cleanliness, the overall experience that the customer has. So dig into that a little bit more.
So when I'm talking to folks who, let's say, are going to redo a store or they're going to build a new store, I often ask them to think about the physical space, absent product and absent people to start. In other words, how can we make the physical space more compelling before we ever put product in, which should raise the bar, and before we ever really think about the kinds of folks and processes and so on and so forth. And when you think about that, we have so much knowledge now in terms of the benefits of less, not more, the benefits of specific architectural details, the benefits of what kind of lighting do we put in? If we go out with a partner or a friend and we want to have a meal out, why is it that we're drawn to a restaurant that has low lighting more so than a restaurant that's lit up, like Times Square? That is because we contrast lighting dilates the pupils, right? And so we are more likely to engage emotionally with somebody if our pupils are dilated. So when I talk to the retailer setting that up, I'll say, have contrast lighting. Yes, you need lighting in your case. Yes, you need lighting above your case, but you should also have some, whether it's your walkways or elsewhere, you should have some shades, some darker areas so that the interplay between light and shade becomes in and of itself a character in your play. The other thing is scent. We know that the olfactory nerves are really, really important to human beings. So, in other words, what we smell and what this scent. I think we were talking previously about, the Westin Hotel, for instance. When you go into a Westin Hotel anywhere in the world, once you walk into the lobby, you get a certain scent, and that scent is the same scent in every Western hotel because they know that by creating that sort of olfactory experience, it helps people to be a little bit more emotive and a little bit more connected. And then the third one, and you could go on and on with these, but the third big one to me is music. That not just having music, but having music such that it's clear you can understand what's being said. I mean, obviously, we don't want crazy, out of control music. The music has to align with the environment, which has to align with your target customer. But you want quality sound system, right? And if you're picking your Pandora or whatever it might be, ask yourself, is this consistent with the kind of customers I'm looking to attract here? Because if you're playing music that's off-putting to your demographic, you're going to have some issues. So those are just, three things there where we have lighting, you have scent, and you have music. Before you ever do anything else, you've already begun to create that platform, that stage to put your business in.
You're bringing me all the way back to one of my favorite books that I haven't read in a while, Paco Underhill, The Science of Shopping, Why We Buy. And he used to talk about the butt brush. I don't know if you remember this. He did a study, hours and hours and hours of consumer behavior. And, if the aisles were too narrow and, the first time somebody brushed you from behind, it's like, yeah, that was a little uncomfortable. Second time, it's like, what's happening? The third time, the customer actually left the store. I believe it was 90% of the time. So, there are those things before you ever even put people into it, that being intentional about causing the sale is critical. So let's get into the next thing, which is once you put people in. So, the psychology of sales from a salesperson perspective. And, one of the things that you talk about is the paradox of choice. Tell us more about what is the paradox of choice?
Well, it's interesting. By the way, it's been a while since I've read Paco, but I did read a couple of his books, and I did read that one. I forgot the butt brush, but I do love the sound of that. Maybe it's time to go back and revisit that book.
I think he has a
But
new
in
one,
some
actually.
respects, what's that?
I think he has a new book as well. So reminder to pick that
I
up.
think he followed that one up with Why Women Buy, and I love that first one, the big book. In some respects, the Paco's term, right, the butt brush, lends itself to the paradox of choice, because what the paradox of choice says is, and there are reams and reams of psychological findings to support this. In fact, one of the books that I recommended, I sent you a list of 5 books that I think somebody who's looking to get into psychology a little bit should read. And one of them was by Sheena Iyengar, which I forget the exact name of the book now. The Art of Choosing. I think that's what it's called, The Art of Choosing. And that sort of speaks to the paradox of choice, i.e., we are not better off for having more choices, right? Our brain weighs about 2 to 3 pounds and it absorbs 20 to 30% of our energy. And what it likes more than anything else is automaticity. So it doesn't want to have to work too hard. It doesn't want to have to think. So to go back to your comment about Paco, the butt brush, if you have so much stuff going on in your store that you're actually brushing against shelves or aisles or products, there's a pretty good likelihood that you could use Sheena Iyinger's book, The Art of Choosing, and understand a little bit the paradox of choice. Now, one of the examples that I use is you go into a restaurant to sort of say, here's what the paradox of choice is really about. If you go into a restaurant and you are wading through a book of menu options, it's very, very stressful. It's time consuming. It engenders a tremendous amount of anxiety for a lot of people. But if you go into a restaurant and it's got 6 items on it or 5 items on it, you're going to get one meal. But the process of navigating a menu with 5 items or 6 items is so much easier. It aligns so much better with how our brain wants to behave than having to sort of wade through page after page after page. And I think that's a good analogy for retail stores in general, that like we know what Lululemon is about when we go in there. We know before we go in. We know what Warby Parker is before we walk into that store. If you're running a retail operation where and I know I'm sort of repeating myself on this, where you're asking the customer to figure out what it is you're about, I don't think you're better off for that. So, and I think this is very true of, like you talk about your son, I've got 4 kids in their 20s. And I remember going into Warby Parker years ago to pick up a pair of glasses with one of my sons who was probably 15 or 16 at the time. He's, in his 20s, well into his 20s now and working. And when we walked in the door of Warby Parker here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he said, "Oh, this is what you talk about, Dad, or write about, or whatever it might be." He, even at 15 or 16 years of age, understood that when he crossed the threshold of that retail store, he could see exactly what the store was about.
Right.
He didn't have to work too hard to do it.
That's
and I think there's too many, Wendy, in our industry, and I'm not just talking about the jewelry business, but I think in retail in general, who think we are better off for having more choice, for having more options. And what the psychology shows is the more options we have, the harder it is to make a decision. And the more options we have, the more we seek to find the perfect option. And of course, the perfect option doesn't exist. So when it comes to retail sales professionals, there's obviously a whole bunch of things that happen prior to it. But when you get to the point where you're presenting product, what I'll coach sales professionals on is you give the customer 3 options. And they should make an awful lot of sense relative to what you understood, what was most important to them, what kind of budgets they ought to have been in, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, you give them 3 choices. And if you think about something like Home and Garden TV, right, which my wife and I are fans of, when they sit down to make a decision about what house, they're always given 3 choices. There's always 3. When you go to get an ice cream, it's, do you want a small, medium, or large? When you go to get a drink, do you want a small, medium, or large? Because psychologists know that giving us choice matters because agency and control matters from the time we're infants. But if you give us too many choices, our brain shuts down and says, this work is too hard for me. So I think the paradox of choice is less, not more.
Yeah, could not agree more. And, you think about that as we're talking about the evolution of retail, one of the most common themes, as you know of, that we're seeing is these larger, traditionally big box stores that are now going into retail stores. And there's a Toys R Us in Macy's, and it's this small space. Macy's has gone from these big, huge stores to being these smaller stores. So I think finally, as part of this evolution, businesses are realizing exactly what you're saying, that less is more. And in the selling process as well, we teach the same thing. When I'm working with my jewelers, I even take it down from 3 to 1 because there is power once you've done the work to understand the needs, wants, and desires of that customer and not go anywhere near the product until you know the one, especially in bridal. This poor man is coming in and there's all these expectations in social media of how they're going to propose and what they're going to buy and the size of the diamond and, all these things that this poor individual walks into the store and it's like, oh my goodness, I'm so overwhelmed. Do I do lab created? Do I do mine? Do I do the magic 1 carat? And to be able to not go anywhere near product. Traditional retail was, I'm looking for an engagement ring, and we go straight to the display case and we bring out the biggest, the best, no, 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 no. Like to go through the process of relationship building and determining the needs, wants, and desires, and then stopping and knowing, you know what, Peter? I have the exact ring that is going to be perfect for your wife to be. Can I show you? And you're exactly right. The psychology says immediately what happens to their brain is this relief of, oh, versus the old show and hope. Oh, well, how about this? Oh, no. How about this? Oh, you don't like that. Right. Which just completely breaks down trust. So how does that affect the psychology of sales? What would you say about that?
I think that there. First of all, I mean, I'm thinking back as we're wont to do when we have these kinds of conversations, back to my days at Tiffany in Chicago on Michigan Avenue, and I would literally tell the salespeople, when you first engage with a customer, if I see you putting your keys into the case, I will quietly walk over and remove the keys. I'll
Yes.
literally take it. They used to
Yes.
have them on these little rubber bands or whatever, the stretchy bands. And I would say, so what we have to do is we have to engage with that human being and understand what makes him or her tick before we start throwing, which is really what you're describing, product dumping, right?
That's
We're
right.
just simply product dumping. The finding the perfect one is interesting and I think would make for a show in and of itself, because I think the one thing that you do that, yeah, and again, psychology has shown us this, is that if you think back to our kids when they were actual babies, right? And they're lying there in the crib and they're reaching up for things, having control, having agency, or at least believing we have control suggests that I want to give the consumer some choice. Now, that doesn't mean, as you've said, there can't be an absolute one, but I think we're better for having some options. But again, as we increase the options, it makes it neurologically more challenging for people to actually do anything. And in that situation, what you get is, and we've seen this certainly over the years, let me think about this. Can you write this on your card? And let me think about this. What you're really saying is, either you didn't listen to me at all in the first place, you didn't ask me the right questions, you weren't observing all of the nonverbal indicators I was giving you, looking away from what you were showing me or shifting my body to another direction, et cetera, et cetera. Or you gave me so many options
That's
that
right.
my brain is saying, "Hey, let's get out of here, buddy. It's time to go. I got to get back to more important things like getting you across the street without getting killed, or finding some food so you don't starve to death." And so I
Right.
think that having choices matters, but the more choices we add, the worse off we are for it.
Well, and that leads me to think about this new consumer that's walking into the store. And what we're finding is, it used to be before the internet that especially with high-end purchases, electronics, furniture, jewelry, high touch, high end, a consumer would go to 5, 6, 7, even 8 stores before they actually would make a decision. Today, what we're seeing is consumers who are walking into a brick and mortar store, and the majority of the time, they have already done some research and they have choice. And so they are going to go into the stores that they want to go into, and they oftentimes even have an idea of what it is that they want. And so we're finding that there's really three reasons that somebody is coming into a brick and mortar store. Number one, they want to touch it, they want to hold it, they want to feel it, they want to experience it, or they have a question that they haven't been able to find online, or they need confirmation. So they want that expert. And maybe they just don't trust what they see online. And so again, they just want to see it. So how does this new consumer coming into the store that has a higher intention to purchase and may actually purchase at the first store versus going to 8, how does this affect the selling process today?
Well, I think that we can take sort of more information being available in very different ways, and I think that the ready access to real-time information is hugely, hugely important. Like if you look at what's happening online. So in the 2 big years of COVID, let's call them sort of after that 20 where everything hit, 21 and 22, we did less than 15 cents on the dollar in the US online. And that sort of blows your head because you think, hold on a second, if we couldn't go to stores, why wasn't online business 50%? Why wasn't it 60%? And even today, rather 2023, we're still doing about 84 cents plus in physical retail. Now, to your point, a lot of the journey for that 84% or 85%, whatever the exact number is, starts at home, or it starts on the handheld device, or it starts on the laptop. And so there is the decision to come to store A or store B. In some respects, in the olden days, you'd sort of go from A to B to C to D, and now you may just go to that one store because you've done a little bit of research online. It would be a mistake to believe, because of the accessibility of more information, that the instruments of human engagement are less important in that world. I would argue that they're actually even more important.
I would agree.
Yeah, and one of the statistics I think that best sort of captures that is 95% of our cognition occurs beneath our awareness. So in other words, I may know that I've got a big event coming up, but the idea that I'm going to know exactly what I want, or as you sort of alluded to, I'm not sure I trust my own instinct about what I saw online, etc. I don't think that we can make those assumptions. We need to understand that when a human being has an opportunity to engage with another human being, great mutual discovery, and I emphasize the word mutual discovery, can happen as a consequence of that. We think of empathy, which is so hugely important. And we oftentimes think of that as my willingness and ability to listen to you and to observe, the nonverbals as well. But what it also means is engaging with you and syncing, mirror neurons, syncing with you to the extent that we both find something exciting in the process of that engagement. And so to imagine that somehow that's not important because somebody can get a whole bunch of product information online, to me, doesn't make any sense. And we may get into it on the next podcast. I suspect it probably would be worth doing it. But what I have some pretty compelling data on is those who know the most about product, and in our industry, of course, we have good metrics for that, tend to be the worst sellers of those products.
I would agree. Yes.
They tend to be the worst sellers. And so I think, I mentioned to you the other day about one of the posts that I put, I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and one of the posts I put up is, more product knowledge won't move people, but more people knowledge will move more product. And somebody from a retail jewelry chain showed it to a brand new person as an inspiration, and that person turned around and sold a $20,000 ring without any help from anybody because
That's
she
the
understood.
proof.
Yes, it sort of gave her permission
That's
to
right.
say, I don't need to be a product expert, and I don't need to have 10, 15 years of experience. What I need is to care enough about that person in front of me to engage with them and find out what matters to them. And if you do that, the byproduct is very nice sales.
Yeah. Well, I love, Peter, the intentionality that you put around sell in and sell through, not just, from a salesperson perspective, from an overall environment perspective, all things that we have complete control over. You are certainly a wealth of information. I so appreciate your information about, the paradox of choice and, does product knowledge really get you there? And product knowledge without people knowledge is just not going to get you there. And so, we could certainly talk about this for hours. As we start to wrap this up, though, what do you think if I'm a salesperson just starting out? My son is 25 years old and he's just starting his career in sales. And, I love how passionate he is about creating relationships with customers and, he's hungry for information. So our listeners who are just starting out in this whole career of sales, what advice would you give them?
First thing I want to just qualify that when I talk about people knowledge, not product knowledge, you need to have a basic awareness of your product,
Of
right? So
course, yes.
let me say that first. I obviously coach my own kids at Wendi, and the consistent theme that I would have used with them, and I would think everybody, there's no excuse, and especially not nowadays, is you have to be a lifelong learner, right? So if you're in sales and you want to be effective in sales and you want to get better, and I think for the age that I'm at and for all of the years of experience that I bring to it, I will read something today that will give me a different way of thinking about something than I thought about it yesterday. You should devote, I don't care, 20 minutes is all it takes. If you're devoting at least 20 minutes a day to self-education around if you're obviously, since we're talking about sales, around psychology, around, what makes humans motivated. You talked about Paco Underhill's books. I've got books that are available. You've got, we're going to have some books I know in the show notes. You have TED Talks, you have podcasts, there's so many resources available to people today, where even if they're not book readers, like my last book I wrote for non-book readers, right? Because it's literally sales minute, randomly open a page, read if there's a page that says paradox of choice or a page that says contrast principle, read it and put that into play today. That takes 1 minute to read one page, but finding 15, 20 minutes a day for self-education around selling and around engaging with human beings, to me, is the single best thing they can do. And what we tend to do, and especially in your business and my business, we tend to put a massive amount of emphasis on product learning, as though somehow learning more about the product is going to make us engage better with other human beings. And that's simply not the case. So read, listen to podcasts, watch TED Talks, do something every single day. And I think that will be, because it's like a good rabbit hole, right? Once you go into it, it leads you into so many other places. People ask me all the time, where do you find the books? I'll read 50, 60 books a year, and probably 30 or 40 of them are around psychology. And when people say, well, where do you find those books? From the book I'm reading today, I will be highlighting at some point in that book two other books that they're referencing.
Right.
And that's how I find them.
Yeah. Well, and I would tag on to that too, Peter. And I love, it's taking 15, 20 minutes every single day to just learn, grow. It's an investment in yourself. Time is currency. So are you willing to really invest in yourself? Because you're exactly right. You never get there. You just never get there.
The journey is everything.
The journey is everything. And I would even take it to the next level. And I love to dispel this whole knowledge is power thing, because I just could not disagree more. There's no power in the knowledge. The power is in the application. So as you're learning, as you're growing, as you're gaining more knowledge, it's more accurate to say applied knowledge is power. So, I love that you're putting this into practice, that you are making more sales, that you are partnering with people to make environments better. And so I just appreciate your wisdom. I appreciate you sharing that with our listeners. And I will go ahead and put your books as resources in the show notes. I will also put some of the books that you have recommended in the show notes. We also will have how to get a hold of you. Peter, how though what's the best way to get a hold of you if somebody wants to connect with you?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I think that LinkedIn and that's maybe I'll connect that to sort of one other thing I would tell people. Don't think for one second that LinkedIn is not for you, that it is only for, C-suite people and folks with tons of experience. You can find me on LinkedIn. I will always respond to people. I'm always engaging on there. That's where I'll post my own articles. That's where I'll post comments. That's where I'll post quotes. And I go there every single day and I find learning. So I think LinkedIn is number one. The retailsmiths.com is my website. So that's retailsmiths, plural.com is my website. And those are probably the best two places to get a hold of me.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you again, Peter. And for our listeners, make sure that you tune in to our next podcast with Peter, that we are going to talk about the 12 essential questions that Peter asks in the interview process to help uncover great retail sales talent. So, Peter, thank you again. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Unleashed, the Leadership Blueprint.
Thanks for listening to Unleashed with Wendi Swanson. Make sure to subscribe and follow to be notified when the newest episodes of the podcast go live. Please take a moment to rate and review us. It helps others discover Unleashed and join our movement of forward-thinking leaders. You can find contact information and important links in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode, and remember, keep leading with authenticity, embrace change, and choose to live life unleashed.